In this section, we are discussing a question that how will you handle timer-based events in JavaScript. The category of this question is DOM and web-related question, and we will discuss 4 different questions which can be asked related to this topic. Let's begin with the answer. So to handle the timer-based events, there are 2 methods globally available called setTimeout and setInterval. When I say globally, it means that both setTimeout and setInterval are part of the window object. So these 2 methods can be used to handle timer-based events. setTimeout executes only once after a given number of intervals, whereas setInterval keeps on executing. Let's check both the methods practically. We will begin with setTimeout. The syntax of setTimeout is like this, that the first parameter is the function name which you want to call, and the second parameter is the interval, that is milliseconds. Let's say you give 1000 milliseconds, that means it will be 1 second. Let's try a code sample with this. I have a kind of template where I have an h1 and I have given an ID also to it, and also a button. When I click on this button, then it's going to call a function called tryTimer, and that will execute the setTimeout. When the setTimeout is executed, we are going to change the text of this h1. Let's try that. Here I'll say setTimeout. Assume that I'm going to call a function named test, and that is after 2 seconds, that is 2000 milliseconds. Now I'm going to write a function here. I'll say function test. And inside this, because I want to change the text of h1, I will say document.getElementById. by ID. The name of the h1 is txt, and the value of that h1 is referred with inner HTML. And here I will say timed out. That's it. I will save this and let's execute the output. Alright, so now I'm clicking on this button, start timer. So as you can see that after 2 seconds, this message is changed. This is what setTimeout does. As I mentioned, it executes only once. It doesn't keep on executing. If you want that it should execute constantly, then we will use setInterval. But before we move to setInterval, I would also like to change the syntax here. The function which we have written here, that has a name, that is we have a named function. But let's say you have a small process to execute, then you can go with anonymous function, that is a function without a name. So I can simply say function, or I can go with arrow function also. Let me begin with function itself first of all, the traditional way I mean, right? I don't give name of the function, and this statement which we have written in this test function, that I will shift and paste it here, and I will remove this test function. Saving the file and refresh, and we execute it again. So we still have the same output. Compared to the previous code, what we have done here is we have just written an anonymous function. Of course, instead of writing the traditional function, I can go with arrow function as well, right? So I can say I remove the function keyword and put an arrow. So this is converted into an arrow function. Let's write that timed out with arrow function. Let's go to the browser. I will refresh the screen. Click on the start timer. And after 2 seconds, we have this message. So here setTimeout, we have tried with a function with a name, and an anonymous function is also a valid syntax. It all depends on your choice, whether you have more lines to execute or you have few lines. If you have few lines, you can go with this anonymous syntax, or you can try the function with a name. In short, setTimeout will execute the process and the job is done. setInterval, on the other hand, keeps on executing the process. The syntax is similar to setTimeout, that is, it can take a function with a name or an anonymous function, and the second parameter is interval in milliseconds. Let's try setInterval with an example. Now instead of setTimeout, I'm just going to say setInterval. Now because the message is same, we will not get the idea whether it is constantly executing it or not. So what we can do, we can take a variable here. Let's say I take variable let counter is equal to 0, right? And here I'm going to assign the counter instead of a message. And every time the interval is executed, I'm going to increment the counter. And let's change the milliseconds also. Instead of 2 seconds, I will say 1 second. That is 1000 milliseconds. Rest of the code remains same. That is when I click on this start timer, this try timer will be executed and it's going to update the counter in the H1. Let's go to the browser. I will refresh and click on the start timer. Now as you can see, we have this start timer button clicked and constantly the counter is getting updated. So this is the difference between set timeout and set interval, that set interval doesn't stop. But what if you want to stop it? If you want to stop it, then you can use a method called clear interval, which can be used to stop the interval. Let's try that. Let's have another button. Here we'll say, let me stop the timer, and I can say stop timer is the method I want to execute. That is the function we are going to create. So here I will create a function called stop timer. Now the question is, even if I write clear interval, the syntax is that we need to pass a timer reference inside this clear interval. So when we create this interval, we have to take it in an object. That is the interval reference, we have to take it in an object. So what will we do? We will create a global object saying, let's say timer object, right? Here I will say that TOBJ is equal to set interval. So now what happens? The interval which we have created is assigned to this TOBJ, and that we are going to pass here. I'll say I want to stop the TOBJ. So clear interval and TOBJ. I'm saving this. I'll go back to the output. Let's refresh this. I'll say start timer, which starts the timer. And now when I click on the stop timer, it has stopped. Again, if I want to say the start timer, it starts from the next counter. And when I click on the stop timer, it stops it because we are using the clear interval method. Here one more important thing is, when we are calling the get element by ID, we are using the document object. But here with a clear interval, set interval or set timeout, we are not using document object, because these methods like clear interval or set interval or even set timeout for that matter is not part of document object. They are part of the global object called window. So certainly you can say window.setTimeout or window.setInterval, but you don't need that because anyway it's a global object. So now you know how you can deal with various timer related events in JavaScript. Let's discuss relative questions of this topic. The first question can be, explain the difference between set timeout and set interval. So now you already know that set timeout executes only once, whereas the interval is something which keeps on executing. The second question is, why can't we write document.setTimeout or document.setInterval? That also we have discussed that set interval or timeout, they are actually part of window object and not the document object. Third question, how can you stop a timer? So we have used the clear interval. Remember that whenever you use set interval, you can use, let me share the code. You can use without this TOBJ, that is any reference we are taking. If you are using without reference, then you have no scope to stop the interval at a later stage. In case if you need to have a functionality to stop the interval, then certainly you will have to use an object, right, which takes the reference of it, and then you use clear interval on that object, which will stop that interval. You can have multiple intervals and each interval can have different object which you can handle. That means you can start and stop anytime. And the fourth question is, this is a kind of practical question, that how will you create a digital clock? Now when it comes to creating a digital clock, let me go back to the code. We have shown a counter. Now instead of this, if I simply say new date, which will return date and time both, right? You can format the time only, but at the moment I'm just saying new date. Every time, after every second, I just want to assign the new date. So let's go to the output. I'll say start timer. As you can see now, the clock is ticking because every second the new date is assigned, and date also has the timer section. Of course, you can change this. You can give a format so that it shows only the clock, not the date along with it, right? And certainly this has more functionality, that is stopping the timer, because we have already stopped the timer in the code. So this answers the fourth question. So this is it for this question related to the timer events.